Canadian part of the world. Really excited. We have finally yesterday finished part 13, which was the end of chapter 1. We finally got there, a whole chapter completed. And so really it's exciting today to be able to start chapter 2. I'm just super excited about this. This is going to be, I'm excited to see where this is going to go, you know. So as normal, the routine for this is, yeah, I've got things I can say and I will, but also for you guys that are on the live call with me to give your thoughts, to give your questions, you know, and there is collective wisdom in the virtual room, so to speak, you know, so let's really utilize that. So, you know, and if you're watching online, you can join us live in the room, you can be a part of the conversation. That would be awesome, because I feel this is what makes these so powerful. You know, I've done lots of video ministry over the years when it's just me talking to a camera, but actually there's something special about having you guys with me so we can talk and discuss and we can throw some stuff around together, and I think this is really powerful. So that's my favourite part of this, is having you guys with me doing this. I could do it by myself, but it'd be very boring, and I would get through this very quickly. So we're going to start reading verses 1, so Galatians chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. Would somebody like to read for us?
Okay, I read.
Okay.
Chapter 2, Galatians. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also took Titus with me. And I went up by revelation, and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run, or had run, in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised.
Okay, that's good.
Verse 1 to 3.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you. Yes, so we've got here, we've got a time jump, because this book is a little bit, the first 2 chapters are really a little bit of a summary of Paul's relationship with the church and with Revelation. So, you know, the first time jump was years, 1 to 3, where he gets this revelation, and we see there's a 3-year gap in which he spends time in Arabia and in Damascus, and then at the end of that 3 years he goes to visit Jerusalem, where he visits Peter and he visits James. And then he doesn't return to Jerusalem at the church for another 14 years. You know, he's definitely not walking close with his apostles. He's definitely, this is an expression that's come out of the new apostolic reformation of making sure you walk really closely with your apostles and making sure you have a covering. And well, Paul definitely wasn't walking under a covering here. He was definitely just, he in verse 118 he talked with Peter and with James. No doubt he started to share his revelation of what God showed him on the road. We can see that testimony in Acts. He tells that story 3 different times in the book of Acts, so it's always worth reading that testimony of his encounter with Jesus. And then he meets with those guys, and then he doesn't return again for 14 years. That's a huge time gap. I can't imagine, going to have spending 15 days with, some sort of apostle in another country, and then, okay, I'm not going to go back for another 14 years. So there's a big time jump that he gets us involved in. And this time he actually takes people with him, because in that space of 14 years he's built team. With Barnabas and with Titus came along too. So there's in the space of between year 3 where he goes alone and year 14 where he returns with team. Because God's heart is always for team. I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. There you go. There's the nugget in these 3 verses here. He only returned because he knew God was saying for him to go. He didn't return to Jerusalem out of obligation. He didn't return to Jerusalem out of any other reason except God revealed that he should go. And I think this is a really, really important part when we're walking in relationship with God, is that we walk out of that place of revelation. You know, Jesus said in John 5, I only do and see what I hear the Father do and see. And so there is this place of revelation that Paul is walking in here, that he is only going back to Jerusalem because knows that God is leading him back to Jerusalem. And we see this all the way through Paul's life when he talks about how God is leading him to Rome and God is leading him to these different places, and how God stopped him from going here and God stopped him from going there. That the hand of God led Paul circumstantially, really, in a lot of ways. You know, his heart desire at one point was to go to Rome and really visit them, and he records in the book of Romans that, you know, I was stopped many times. Circumstances came against me, because he said the Lord did not permit me to go. So when circumstances go wrong, Paul didn't blame the devil. I know many charismatics want to blame the devil when things go wrong and circumstances go against what they want and what they feel is good. But actually, Paul had a revelation that God was greater than the devil. And if if the circumstances were stopping him from going to a certain place, then maybe God was in that. It reminds me of the story of Balaam, but I'll come back to that. If you guys have got any thoughts, please jump in at any point, okay?
I really like what you're saying here with this, Ed, because it reminds me of how we're to walk in the Spirit. We're supposed to be guided by the Holy Spirit. He is our guide. He is our instructor. He directs our steps. You know, all those different scriptures that talk about that. And here we see Paul doing that in, like you said, in several different situations. So I find that interesting that those scriptures spoken about in other places, that here he's modeling it.
No, definitely. Thank you. It just gives us an insight in how to walk out revelation. You know, and that's really key. That we learn not only to walk out our revelation with God, but how to walk that out in community. You know, and there's that tension in walking out revelation of, you know, which is, you know, screw you, I'm just going to do what I want. And the opposite tension to that is, well, I'm not going to do anything unless my pastor tells me, and I have 3 angels come to my room, and so we go to the other extreme, where, you know, we're constipated because nothing will pass through us, you know, spiritually speaking. And actually there is a tension that needs to be held, because both those positions are partly true. You know, so there is some truth in getting counsel and wisdom, but there is some truth where you have to ignore counsel and wisdom and just go, do you know what, I just got to do what God tells me to do. And so the problem is, there was a Honda advert many years ago for the Honda Accord, and it talked about the power of and. And I really think this really resonated with me at the time, and I still think it's true. That as the church, we have to choose one or the other. It's this or it's that, or it's black or it's white, or it's grace or it's law, or it's, well, that was true really. It's love or it's spirit. It's, you know, we want to make people choose between two things. And actually I think most things are an and, where it's power and love. It's hearing the Spirit and it's reading the Bible. It is hearing God and doing what he says and walking in community. I think that, you know, to quote the advert, the power of and is really, really important, because I think the power of and empowers us to not be too locked down in being so binary in our walk with God. Well, it's this or it's that. It's right or it's wrong. Well, there's many things that are not so clear cut in life, but we don't take that same attitude into things of the Spirit. And for me, there's probably two non-negotiables in terms of theologically non-negotiables: the virgin birth and the sinless nature of Jesus. That's it for me. That's it. Nothing else is non-negotiable. Everything else is negotiable, and everything else is open. Those two, I don't think you can get around, because I think they unpacked. There's too much depending on them. They're like the load bearers in Revelation. But yeah, I think I think we need there's the power of and. Yeah. If no one's going to stop me, I'm going to keep reading. Okay. While I was there, I met privately with those who considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. So he's had 14 years to work out his revelation to see if it really works. So he's going to them not just with an idea, not just with a revelation. He's also going to be sharing testimony with them as well of, okay, this is the message I preach. And you can guarantee they're going to ask the same thing every church leader asks. Well, how is it working out in your life, Paul? Have you ever been in a meeting with a leader or a pastor where you bring them your new revelation and they say, well, how is that working in your life? And I think this is a really important test of revelation, is actually if it's really God, it's going to bear out in our life. And so no doubt he shared the message with them, but he will have also shared how it had borne out in the field, so to speak. Literally, he was going preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, which at this point the church was a very new idea to do. Oh, Gentiles need to be saved, really? Oh, I just thought it was us Jews. So Paul's scope is being widened because God commissioned him to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So he met with those who were considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. So he was also somebody who recognized authority. Yes, Kelly, go for it.
Can you park there for a second?
Yes, let's park.
I have a question about why he felt like he wanted to be sure he was not running and had not been running my race in vain. Because maybe you unpacked that already while my son was interrupting me.
No.
But the first time Paul went after the 3 years, the reason he went was because he was seeing fruit. We talked about that. He was seeing the fruit of what he was doing in that 3 years time. So we went to Jerusalem to go talk to Peter, blah, blah, blah. Here, it sounds like after 14 years, it sounds like he's a little unsure of himself and wondering, trying to checking with everybody else to make sure he's not running his race in vain. So, but he's been doing it for 14 years now, perfecting his message and stuff with the Lord, and like you said, widening his scope with the Gentiles and whatever. But why would he? Well, I guess it doesn't. It might not really say what. It sounds like he's shaken, and he wants to check with them to be sure that he's on the right track or whatever. Can you?
Yes. I think the Apostle Paul was never a man to be shaken by anything. So we know of his character, he was not an easily shaken man. So that doesn't really match with what we know about Paul in terms of being shaken by the opinions of other people, because we know for these 17 years he would have been persecuted by many, many people. So why is he going to leadership and trying to get buy-in with them? Well, because the one thing that shuts down anything is leadership. If leaders are not supporting what you do, it ain't happening in any organization, in any group of people. So he's not been to Jerusalem for 14 years. And he's like, do you know, I need to go back and just make sure we're all on the same page with this, because I don't want to be preaching this and they're behind my back saying something different. And so there's this idea that Paul understands that even if he's right and leadership quietly start to challenge what Paul is saying, that's going to stop Paul from being effective, even though maybe... So I think it's a case of, he'd not been for 14 years, let's go back and just make sure I'm not wasting my time, that we all are on the same page, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here, that we're all on message, that we all really are talking about grace, because I don't want to be talking about grace and you're behind my back talking about law, and talking about how this needs to happen, the other needs to happen, and so, because this is what happened, in the background of the early church, there was people who were going around going, oh, I love the Apostle Paul, he's lovely, he's great, and he preaches such a great message, but you just need one more thing, boys, come and get circumcised. And there was people that were going behind Paul through this 14 years who were, we talked about this a few things ago, and so maybe, and we don't really know, maybe part of the reason was, one, to make sure leadership is still on side with him, and he's still they're all singing from the same page, so that his efforts aren't wasted, and that he's not doing it for nothing. Because the one thing that wastes your time is if leadership are not in agreement with what you're doing, even if you're the great Apostle Paul, because it's going to be Peter, James and John, the guys who were the inner circle of Jesus. And if those guys are saying, this Apostle Paul, I think he's missed it, we think you've got to have a little bit of law and and he knows it's going to shut everything down. And so I think I don't think he's shaken. I think he's, at this point, he's even more persuaded of the gospel, but he's wanting to make sure the boys in Jerusalem are singing the same song that he is, and that we're on the page together. I don't know if that makes sense. If anybody's got any other ideas, I'm happy to.
That makes much more sense. I'm glad.
And we have, and what we do, we have Paul's in verse 3, and they supported me and did not even demand that my companion Titus be circumcised, though he was a Gentile. So not only did he have the words of the guy saying, Paul, you're doing a great job, we really believe in you, they didn't make Titus, who was a Gentile, be circumcised. Because this was a big deal in the early church, that, there was a lot of people going around and saying, well, if you're going to become a Christian, you've got to become a Jew first. And then to be a real Christian, you've got to Judaize, and then you're a real Christian and you're in. And so they were always trying to add one thing, and for boys it was, circumcision. And so, but because Peter, the apostles in Jerusalem say, do you know what? Don't worry about Titus doesn't need to be circumcised. Why? Because Titus is Gentile. He's not under the law. We don't have to become Jews to become Christians. And so I imagine that action would really have put Paul's mind at rest, that they were singing from the same hymn sheet, that they were all in agreement. Because they weren't just saying the right words, the guys were backing up with action. Like, you know what? Don't worry about the circumcision, it's not important.
I have questions.
Yes.
Okay, help me to understand this part. Okay. For Paul, right? If he takes 14 years to go to find out whether he's on the same page, of course he only went because the Lord told him this time.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also, how to say, okay, we know that from this section is like he's going there to get the approval of the leaders, so that the leaders also can bless him and can send him forth. But on the other hand, Paul is also a person who preach according to what the Lord reveals to him. Correct me wrong, my mind is a little bit scattered in there. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that on one hand, it seems to me that it doesn't really matter to Paul whether or not he's on the same page with the other leaders, because he only preached by the revelations that God gives. On the other hand, he also wants to be on the same page to get the blessings. But he already started preaching to the Gentiles, so I'm a little confused here.
Yeah, because Paul was not a binary man, so the opinions and people didn't persuade Paul, and he knew what he was preaching, and he knew what was true. But also he knows that if his message is going to have success in the church, he does need to have buy-in, to use a business term, from the apostles, because they do have sway in the church. And so, yes, he's not persuaded by their message, but he also, if if they are preaching a more law-based message that's different to his, then he needs to maybe think about a separation at some point, because those two things don't mix. So I think if we look at this in a binary way, well, which is it, Paul? Do you like people's opinions, or do you like not people's opinions? Which is it, Paul? Come on, make up your mind. And Paul's like, no, I'm not going to make up a mind. Because actually, it's both of those are important. And it's this tension of holding I only am going to do what God wants me to do, but also I'm going to walk in relationship and consultation with other people. And if we choose one or the other, then we're going to be in error. But if we choose both of them, and again, I think what you highlight there is really important, that he went only because God told him it was time to go and talk to the boys at Jerusalem. So he knew it was time for this. He knew, it was because God was sending him to go and talk to Jerusalem. And so I don't know if I'm hearing your question right, but I think for me it's Paul's having both intention. That his opinions of men don't matter to him, and he goes on a little bit, in a couple of verses and says, their reputations doesn't really bother me at all. So if their reputations don't really bother him, why is he going to talk to them? It doesn't make sense. Those two behaviors are contradictory. Well, Paul's not binary. Paul understands authority, and Paul understands the flow of authority, and that if you want to have influence, then you need buy-in from leadership. And if leadership are not going to buy in and support what you're doing, then you need to separate from leadership, because otherwise it's not going to have the endorsement and the power that it needs. And so it's for me, it's not contradictory. Those both things are important. I don't know if I'm answering this right at all for you.
Okay, so which means to say that because pardon me, because I have not studied Paul's life yet. So does it mean that initially, because Paul holds the message of grace that is for both Gentiles and Jews, mm-hmm. and he's the one who holds the revelation to reconcile both. Mm-hmm. So initially he was assigned by God to bring the message, deliver the message to the Gentiles, mm-hmm. so which he did for the 14 years. Mm-hmm. And the Lord says, time right now, go to Jerusalem, go to the Jews, and bring them the message and gel them together, because he's the senior priest. So in that sense, Paul then, in order to then, penetrate through the Jewish culture and their thinking, then he has to start to go there and ensure that they are all on the same page before he starts to publicly preach. Is that?
No. He's been publicly preaching, and because we see, I shared the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. So he's already been preaching. He already knows it works. So it's a case of he's not wanting them to get their blessing to go and do it. He's wanting to know if he has their continued support. Because if he doesn't, then he needs to make a decision about what he does. And I think this is the way, I think what we're hitting upon here is a way that modern church operates that's different to how the New Testament church operates. Modern church operates, you have an idea, before you do anything, you talk to your leaders, and if your leaders are not in agreement, then it doesn't happen. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't match what the early church did. Paul did his thing, and then when he saw it was real, it was working, there was fruit, there was blessing, he then went to leadership and said, okay, this is what God's doing through me right now, showed them fruit, showed them the message, and they were still in support of him and still endorsed a message of grace. So I think that we're hitting upon a tension between 21st century church and first century church, and as a leader, when I had my church about 10, 12 years ago, I never operated like that. I operated more like Paul's operating here, just somebody comes to me with an idea, well, go and do it, what do you need? Just go and see if it works. If it works, it's God. If it doesn't work, it's not God. Okay, that's easy. I'm in that sense, I'm very binary. Well, God's told me I'm going to be this great apostle to the whole of the world. Well, go and be an apostle then. Go and do it. What do you need? How can I help you? If I've got a relationship and know and trust that person, then okay, well, how can I help you? What do you need? Go and do it. You know, I think so many people in the modern age are waiting for endorsements before they'll go and do something. They're waiting for, we've already touched on this, so this is a repetition a little bit. But this is not how Paul operated. Paul received his revelation. After that 3-year period, he went to build relationship a little bit with Peter and James. And then after he'd been preaching this gospel for a period of time, he went back to go to Jerusalem. Okay, this is what God's doing. This is how he's moving. This is how he's blessing. What do you think, guys? So
I think the history background there kind of helps me to understand.
You're right, because if you just read it cold, it sounds like Paul's being crazy.
At first I thought why he did like so a little bit contradicting. Okay, but let's say for example, like you just said, you know, that is how he worked back then, and right now in our generation, this is how we always look for endorsement first. We do know that the Bible is a guidebook, you know, it's like a book that helps us, you know, it shows us principles of how we can actually follow. How the Lord leads the people. But back in now that it's in our generation, of course, at the end of the day, it is still by Lord's leading. But I just want to know, since you also do say that that's not how Paul works, then so sometimes, you know, we can be led by the way that Paul works. You know, but in our generation, in our time, do we still apply Paul's way, our modern way, looking for endorsement first, combining both, being led by the Spirit, or?
Okay, I think it depends on there's a question that needs to be asked. Is the reason you're talking to leadership is because you want their help or you want their insight? And I think there are two different things. I think sometimes when people go to leadership with their ideas, it's because they're needing something from leadership more than just, God bless you, go and do it. They're needing some support, they're needing some resource, they're needing some backing in some way. And they're usually going to leadership with, God's calling me to be a missionary to China. So, you know, and then in their heart, they want the pastor to turn around and say, well, God bless you, we're going to pay you $2,000 a month, go be a missionary. Because they really, in their heart, they're wanting something from leadership. Because that's the only way they see it working. And I think, you know, anybody who, and this is something that Sean Bowl said in a video probably last year, a short video. He was at a prophetic retreat with many ministry leaders, and it's like a yearly roundtable he's a part of with really high profile guys. I can only guess who's in the room. You know, Bill Johnson, Shay Arm, you know, Lou Engle. We're talking about, I don't know, I'm guessing. I think that's who was in the room. We're talking about these big guys, and they're talking about raising up the next generation. And they were talking about these systems and things they were putting in place to make sure the next generation is protected and they don't, you know, so, and they were creating these protocols so they could discern how to do stuff and how to release them and when to release them. And Paul and Sean looked at each one in the room and went to him and said, who gave you permission and endorsement to go and do what you did? And the guy sheepishly went, well, nobody. I just went and did it. And then he went around the room, and every single leader who was telling their people following them that you need to come through me if you're going to be released, never went through anybody else. So I think we've created a BS system that blocks up the church, quite honestly. If you were looking that, if you say you're working with a local church and you got an idea that you're going to do like a youth outreach, and so if you're going to the church, say with an idea, well, if I'm going to do this youth outreach, I really need to use the building. Maybe I'm going to need some budget, you know, and you're going there with things that you'll need in order to complete what God is telling you to do, that you need the church's participation in. Then that's a different story. Then that's you're going with an agenda of what you need. But but I think the best way really is the way Paul is go and prove it. You know, and I think this is the same advice that T.D. Jakes gives. Actually, you know, he says, you know, in older cultures, the way you prove your validity is by going out of the tribe and going and killing a lion or a bear and then bringing that back to the village, and the village then receive you differently because you went and achieved something, and you've done something. You've got fruit. You're not just expecting other people to feed you. You went out, you killed your lion, your bear. You've got a history, and now you're bringing the fruit of your encounter back to the village, and that blesses the village. I think so many of us are sitting in the village wanting us to be sent out, when actually God sends you out, and that when you return with fruit, and then the community endorse what's happening. This is what happened in Paul's life, and the book of Acts is a really good example of this. When Paul and Barnabas are given as apostles in Acts 13, it says, separate Paul and Barnabas and Saul for the special work I have called them. They'd already been preaching. They'd already been preaching the gospel. They'd already been doing the thing. And so leadership does not commission you to go and do something. Leadership can only endorse the fruit of what it sees. And this is what happened in the New Testament church. People went and did stuff. People followed the dreams and the vision of the heart. And when there was fruit, leadership got behind it once there was fruit. I think so many of us are wanting leadership to get behind us and to get endorsement before we've got anything to show anybody. All we've got is an idea. And people don't buy into ideas. They buy into fruit. They buy into evidence. And I think this is just a very different way of approaching it. But I think any modern leader worth their salt actually would agree with this. And that you're not initially going to get, if somebody goes to T.D. Jakes and says, I believe God's called him to start a church, I can guarantee T.D. Jakes says, well, go and do it then. Well, can you send me out? No, he's going to say no. Because he wants God to prove himself to that person. And so I think there's a different way of approaching that. We don't need endorsements to do what God has called us to do. But maybe later, once we've got fruit, then we can get leadership involved. Okay, this is what I've been doing. You can go and say, I feel God's called me to do this. You go and do it, and you go back to them and say, okay, now this is what God's doing. This is the fruit. This is the evidence. And then once there's fruit and evidence, then an endorsement comes later. I think so many of us are wanting the endorsement first, rather than later. I don't know if I'm speaking into your space.
Thank you. It does help a lot.
It's just that there's competing difference of leadership in the ideas in the church. So when I have my church, people come to me and say, oh, well, I think the church should be doing like a worship night. I was like, okay, what do you need from me? Well, I was just coming to tell you to go, so I'm just giving you prophetic direction. No. God told you, so that means you're going to go and do it. Okay, so how can I resource you? Well, okay, have the Monday night. Use Monday nights as your worship night. I'll provide a space for you to do it. Oh, okay, right, up to you now. Get on with it. You've got your space. Organize it. Go and be a leader. And I think, and in that, people get to test what God is saying to them. And they get to grow. But if we're always waiting and never testing and never experimenting, then we never grow. The reason I do what I do is because I've tested and experimented over the years with nobody's endorsement. And quite frankly, still nobody's endorsement after 24 years of ministry. I don't need it. Would I welcome it? You damn right I would. If somebody says, Ed, I want to get behind your ministry and bless it, I see the fruit, I see the evidence, I want to support that. Well, bless God, let's come on board, let's walk together. But do you know what? I don't need that. And so it's these two things in tension. I think that's what we're trying to get at these verses. But this is all coming from God, because the key verse I think here is verse 2. I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. And I think walking according to what God is saying, the plan and the purpose of God is really important. Okay, we've been just over 30 minutes. Would anybody like a final thought from somebody else, not me? Any final thoughts from anybody? I guess not. Oh,
Like what you said about allowing people to test what they felt God was speaking to them, before either holding their hand or handing them a cookie. You know what I mean?
totally.
So I really like that. I definitely wrote that down, and I'm gonna be doing that with the people in my discipleship groups and things that I do with the Lord and how I lead. That's one of the things that I'm gonna remember. So thank you for that.
Bless God. Okay, that's a great last thought. Thank you for that, Kelly. Okay, I will see you all tomorrow, guys. I love you all. I love you all. Bless you. Prajat Ipon, as we say in Thailand. Prajat Oipon. Night night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.